Alara Seneth adjusted the intricate layers of her research robe and stepped into the bustling hub of the trade station. The air was alive with the sounds of commerce. Vendors calling out prices, alien languages overlapping, and the occasional announcement over the intercom. For Alara, it was just another assignment. A new environment to study, new species to catalog. Nothing she hadn't done before. Her partner on this mission, a fellow xenobiologist named Rel Karath, glanced at her as they approached their designated research kiosk. "I've run the preliminary scans on the human delegation," he said. "Fascinatingly resilient." "Rel," Alara interrupted, her tone clipped. "Don't start with your anecdotes again. We're here to gather objective data, not to marvel at them like tourists." Rel smirked. "I wasn't marveling, just making an observation. Did you know humans have one of the widest adaptive ranges of any species we've encountered?" "Yes, and I also know that you brought that up 3 times during the last mission briefing," she replied, not breaking stride. "Let's stick to the work at hand. What's the first assignment?" Rel tapped his datapad. "We're supposed to attend their presentation on neural interface advancements. Apparently, humans have developed some impressive biosynthetic hybrids for medical purposes." "Very well," Alara said. "Let's make our way to the conference hall." The two Othanis walked through the bustling corridors, their sharp, angular features and pale, almost translucent skin drawing a few curious glances. But most station inhabitants were accustomed to seeing a variety of species, and their presence didn't cause any more than a passing glance. When they reached the presentation room, the air was thick with anticipation. Alara noted the humans mingling casually with other species, their expressions open, their gestures animated. She had studied humans extensively before this mission, but seeing them interact in person was an entirely different experience. "Good evening," a voice called out. Alara turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered human approach them. His dark hair was slightly unkempt, and his brown eyes radiated warmth. "You must be the Othanis delegation. I'm Marcus Thorne." Alara offered a polite nod. "Dr. Alara Seneth. This is my colleague, Rel Karath." Rel stepped forward and shook Marcus's hand with an enthusiasm that Alara found mildly embarrassing. "Good to meet you, Marcus. I've heard about some of your research. Truly impressive." "Thanks," Marcus said with a smile. "I've been looking forward to meeting you too. I read some of your published works on xenobiological cellular adaptation. Fascinating stuff." Rel beamed. "Well, we're always happy to share knowledge. Maybe we can compare notes sometime." "Definitely," Marcus said. His gaze lingered on Alara, who was still scanning the room, trying to take in as much as she could. "Dr. Seneth, is this your first time working directly with humans?" She met his eyes, her tone neutral. "Yes, though I've studied your species for years. Seeing you in person is simply another step in the data collection process." He laughed lightly. "Fair enough. Well, I hope we can prove to be more than just data points on a chart." Alara raised an eyebrow. "That remains to be seen." Rel, clearly enjoying the interaction, leaned in toward Marcus. "She's a bit of a skeptic. Takes a lot to impress her." "Noted," Marcus said with a grin. "In that case, I'll just have to try harder." The presentation began, and Marcus excused himself to take a seat. As the human speakers detailed their breakthroughs in neural interface technology, Alara found her mind wandering. Not out of disinterest, she was enthralled by the complexity of their work, but because of Marcus. There was something disarmingly open about him, something she hadn't anticipated. Rel nudged her gently. "You're unusually quiet, Alara. What do you think?" "I think," she said carefully, "that humans are more direct than I expected." Rel laughed. "That's one way to put it. I think Marcus likes you." She shot him a look. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm serious. He kept looking at you. Perhaps he's just fascinated by my research credentials," she said flatly. "Not everything is personal, Rel." "Maybe not," he said, his tone teasing. "But it could be. You never know." Alara decided to ignore him and refocused on the presentation. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but recall the warmth in Marcus's voice and the way he'd looked at her. as if he saw something more than just a detached scientist cataloging his species. Chapter 2. A Debate Over Destiny. The arboretum hummed with the soft sounds of flowing water and rustling leaves, an oasis of calm in the busy trade station. Alara stood at the base of a towering glass wall that framed the stars beyond, waiting. The Othana scientist preferred to keep these meetings brief, purely professional. Yet she found herself wondering if today might take a different turn. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned and saw Marcus approaching, his casual stride at odds with the measured precision of her own movements. He carried 2 cups of something warm, steam curling in the cool air. "I wasn't sure if you'd like this," he said, handing 1 cup to her. "It's called chai, something humans drink when we need to clear our heads." She took it hesitantly, sniffing the contents. "The aroma is pleasant," she admitted, "though I don't rely on external substances to achieve clarity." "You're missing out," Marcus said with a grin. "Sometimes a good drink makes a conversation more interesting." "Let's hope the conversation itself is sufficient," she replied, her tone cool. They settled on one of the low benches, facing a small garden filled with alien plants that glowed faintly in the dim light. Marcus sipped his chai and regarded her thoughtfully. "You seem skeptical about humans," he said after a moment. "I've read your research, your focus on biochemistry and neural patterns. But what do you actually think of us?" "I find your species intriguing," Alara said carefully. "Your rapid adaptability, your ability to form strong social bonds. It's all quite remarkable. But I remain unconvinced that your emotional connections are anything more than chemical responses." Marcus leaned back, the cup resting in his hands. "You think we love because our brains tell us to? Isn't that the case?" she replied. "When 2 humans claim to love each other, their neural activity shifts. Hormonal surges cause feelings of attachment and pleasure. It's a logical process, nothing more." Marcus tilted his head, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I don't disagree that chemistry plays a part. But is it really just that? When a mother protects her child, when someone gives up everything for someone else, are those decisions purely biological? Or is there something else happening?" Alara sipped the chai, the warmth surprising her. "Your question presupposes that love is more than a survival mechanism. I've yet to see evidence of that." "Maybe that's because you're looking at it from a distance," Marcus suggested. "Have you ever been in love?" Her brows furrowed. "No, I have no need for such distractions." "Distractions," he repeated, chuckling. "So you think love would hinder your work?" "Of course," she said. "Romantic entanglements often lead to irrational decision-making. My work requires precision and focus." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe you're missing the point. Love isn't about losing focus. It's about finding something that sharpens your view of the world. When you care about someone, you see things differently. You think differently." She regarded him skeptically. "Are you suggesting that love improves one's cognitive abilities?" "I'm suggesting it changes how you experience life," he replied. "It's not just hormones. It's the choices we make, the connections we build. You can measure brain activity all you want, but the experience, what it feels like, that's something you can't quantify." Alara considered this, her gaze drifting to the glowing plants. "You're speaking from personal experience, I assume." He nodded. "I've been in love before. I know what it's like to put someone else's needs above your own, to feel like they're a part of who you are. It's not just about chemicals, it's about meaning." "I see," she said, though her tone betrayed uncertainty. "You believe that meaning transcends biology." "I believe it shapes how we live," Marcus said simply. For a moment, the only sounds were the soft gurgle of the stream and the occasional hum of the station's systems. Alara found herself unsettled by his words, not because she disagreed, but because she didn't have an answer. For someone who prided herself on understanding, it was uncomfortable not to have the last word. "Perhaps I've underestimated the human perspective," she admitted finally. Marcus smiled, leaning back again. "It's not about underestimating. It's about seeing things from a different angle." She nodded slightly, finishing the chai. The warmth lingered, not just from the drink but from the conversation. For the first time, she wondered if there was more to human emotions than she had assumed. Chapter 3: Beyond the Data. The Arboretum's pathways wound between clusters of alien vegetation and soft, glowing ferns, offering a rare moment of stillness amid the otherwise frenetic trade station. Alara walked beside Marcus, their pace slow as they spoke, voices low in the quiet of the artificial night. This was their third meeting in as many cycles. What had begun as a clinical exchange of information had somehow turned into a regular habit. "It's strange," Alara admitted as they strolled. "Humans are more open than I anticipated. In my studies, your species often comes across as guarded when dealing with outsiders." Marcus shrugged, his hands in his pockets. "A lot of us are. But here, on neutral ground, with nothing to fight over, people tend to relax. I think most humans just want to connect, to understand." "Connect?" Alara repeated, her tone thoughtful. "You mean forming personal relationships?" "Exactly," Marcus said. "We like knowing who we're dealing with. It makes cooperation easier." Alara glanced sideways at him. "But such connections carry risks. Emotional ties can cloud judgment, compromise logic." "They can," Marcus acknowledged. "But they can also give you perspective, make you see the bigger picture." Alara didn't respond right away. She found herself comparing Marcus's openness to the structured professionalism of her Othanis colleagues. Among her people, interpersonal bonds were carefully managed, never allowed to interfere with scientific work. Yet here was a human who viewed connection not as a liability, but as an asset. "How do you reconcile it?" she asked after a long pause. "How do you maintain objectivity when emotions are involved?" "You don't," Marcus said with a small smile. "I don't think pure objectivity is possible when you're dealing with other people. But I don't see that as a bad thing. When you care about someone, it forces you to think about things from their point of view. That's not a weakness. It's just a different kind of strength." She raised an eyebrow at him. "You're quite the philosopher, Marcus." He laughed. "Not really. I just like to think that understanding each other makes us better, both as individuals and as a species." They continued walking, their steps crunching softly on the gravel path. Overhead, the massive glass dome showed a stunning view of the stars, a constant reminder of the vast universe that stretched beyond their small gathering place. Alara glanced up at the constellations, their light refracted slightly by the station's atmosphere shielding. "Do you ever feel insignificant?" she asked suddenly. "What do you mean?" "Looking at all of that," she said, gesturing toward the stars. "It's overwhelming. The sheer scale of the galaxy, the number of civilizations. Doesn't it ever make you feel small?" Marcus considered her question for a moment before replying. "Sometimes, sure. But I think that's part of what makes life special. We might be small in the grand scheme of things, but the connections we make, our relationships, the things we care about, they give meaning to our lives. It's not about our size. It's about what we choose to do with the time we have." She was silent, digesting his words. They stopped at a small bench near a cluster of luminescent flowers, their light casting faint, shifting patterns on the ground. Marcus sat down, and after a moment's hesitation, Alara joined him. "I've been trained to view the universe through the lens of data," she said quietly. "Everything can be categorized, analyzed, quantified. Yet you're suggesting that meaning comes from something that can't be measured." "Pretty much," Marcus said with a shrug. "It's not that we reject science or logic. It's just that some things, like relationships, like love, are more about experience than analysis." She turned to him, her expression serious. "And you truly believe that? That love is more than a chemical reaction?" "I do," he said simply. They sat there in silence for a while, the glow of the flowers and the light of distant stars reflecting in their eyes. For the first time, Alara wondered if her rigid view of the universe might be missing something vital. Chapter 4: The First Touch. A series of faint chimes announced the transition to station's artificial evening cycle. The Arboretum's dim lighting grew softer, casting long shadows across the gravel paths and glowing flora. Marcus sat on a low bench under the sprawling canopy of a bioluminescent tree, the faint, shifting light playing over his features. He looked up when Alara approached, her expression as composed as ever, though there was something quieter in her movements tonight. "I thought you might be busy," Marcus said as she joined him. "I completed my reports early," Alara replied, lowering herself onto the bench. "You seem surprised." "Not surprised," he said with a small smile. "Just glad." Alara tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Glad for my company?" "Yeah. I enjoy talking to you." She sat back, letting her gaze drift toward the stars beyond the Arboretum's dome. "That's unusual for me. I'm not accustomed to people wanting to spend time with me outside of a professional context." "Maybe you just haven't met the right people," Marcus offered. "Perhaps," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't convinced. For a while, neither of them spoke. The gentle sounds of the Arboretum, water flowing from an unseen fountain, leaves stirring in the circulating air, wrapped around them. Marcus reached down and picked up a small, smooth stone from the ground, turning it over in his hands. He seemed lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" Alara asked after a moment. He glanced at her, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Just wondering how we got here." "What do you mean?" "I mean this," he said, gesturing lightly between them. "You and me sitting here talking. A human and an Othanis. Two people who probably would have never crossed paths if not for this station, this mission." "Your species often talks about destiny," Alara said, her tone analytical. "But isn't it simply chance that brought us here?" "Maybe," Marcus replied. "Or maybe it's a mix. Chance brought us together. But what we do with that chance is what matters." Alara gave him a sidelong glance. "You have a talent for making the ordinary sound profound." He laughed softly. "And you have a way of making the profound sound ordinary." She blinked, not sure if it was meant as a compliment. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they were both content to share the same space, to let the quiet moments speak for themselves. Then Marcus leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, and turned the stone over one last time before placing it back on the ground. "When I first met you," he began, "I thought you were completely unapproachable." Alara raised an eyebrow. "And now I know you're just mostly unapproachable," he teased, grinning. She let out a quiet laugh, short, but genuine. "I can't tell if that's a compliment or an insult. Take it however you want," he said with a shrug. "All I'm saying is that you've surprised me." "Have I?" she asked, leaning back and folding her hands neatly in her lap. "How so?" "You're more open than you let on," Marcus said. "You've got this layer beneath all that logic and formality. It's like you don't let people see it, but it's there." "I wasn't aware I had such a layer," she said, though her voice held a hint of amusement. "Oh, it's there," he insisted. "And it makes me wonder what else you're not showing." Alara turned to him, her expression carefully neutral. "And what about you, Marcus? Are you showing me everything? Or do you also have layers?" Marcus considered this. "I think everyone's got layers. The difference is whether you're willing to peel them back." She nodded slowly. "An interesting metaphor." "Thanks," he said lightly. "I try." Their eyes met for a moment, and then Alara felt something unexpected. Marcus reached out, his hand brushing a strand of her hair back from her face. The touch was light, brief, but it sent a surprising warmth through her. She stayed very still, her gaze locked on his. "I hope that wasn't too forward," he said, his voice quieter now. I wanted to see if that was okay." "It wasn't unpleasant," Alara said after a pause, her tone carefully measured, "though I'm not sure what prompted it." Marcus smiled, his hand dropping back to his lap. "It just felt right. Sometimes you just have to follow your instincts." "Instincts," she repeated. "Another human trait I'm still trying to understand." "Maybe you don't have to understand it," Marcus suggested. "Maybe you just have to feel it." She looked at him for a long moment, then finally let out a soft breath. "This conversation has taken an unusual turn. Is that a bad thing?" he asked. She shook her head slightly. Not necessarily. Just unexpected. Marcus leaned back again, resting his arms along the back of the bench. Unexpected isn't always bad. They sat there for a while longer, the quiet stretching between them. Elara still felt the faint trace of warmth where his hand had brushed against her, and for the first time, she began to wonder if there might be something more to these human notions of connection than she had once believed. Chapter 5. A Growing Intimacy. The trade station's central promenade buzzed with its usual evening energy. Holographic advertisements flickered above shops, and a diverse array of species moved through the corridors, trading goods, ideas, and the occasional glare of mistrust. Marcus navigated through the crowd with practiced ease, a quiet confidence in his movements. Elara followed a step behind, her eyes scanning everything, as if recording the entire scene in her mind. "Why did you choose this place?" she asked, noting the faint, earthy aroma coming from a nearby food stall. "It's not exactly quiet. Sometimes a little chaos can be good," Marcus said, stopping at a stand selling handcrafted alien artifacts. "Plus, I figured you'd enjoy seeing something more colorful than the Arboretum. I didn't realize you were so invested in my enjoyment," Elara remarked, her tone cool but not unkind. He grinned. "Call it curiosity. I like seeing. She put the sculpture down carefully. "Field observations yield more authentic data. And you suggested I should experience more than sterile environments. So you took my advice?" Marcus teased. "I'm honored. Perhaps I simply wanted to prove you wrong," Elara replied, turning toward him. "And am I?" "Not entirely," she admitted. "This setting is stimulating." Marcus chuckled. "High praise, coming from you." As they moved along the promenade, the din of the crowd created a bubble of intimacy. Their conversations, once guarded and academic, had become fluid and personal, the words flowing naturally. Marcus found himself sharing stories from Earth, his family's small vineyard in Northern California, his first experience in space, the time he nearly set off a station-wide alarm trying to fix a faulty water purifier. Elara listened, her usual clinical demeanor softening as she asked questions, not as a scientist, but as someone genuinely curious. "Your family must have been close," she said as they stopped in front of a display of glowing crystalline flowers. "To remain in one place for so long." "Pretty close, yeah," Marcus said. "My parents were the kind of people who made you feel like the center of the universe. I miss that sometimes." "You seem to have adjusted well to life away from them," Elara observed. "I had to," he said simply. "You can't stay home forever. At some point, you have to find your own way." Elara tilted her head. "And you believe you've found it?" Marcus hesitated, looking at her thoughtfully. "Not completely, but I think I'm on the right path. Meeting new people, seeing how other species live, that's part of it." "And your interactions with me?" she asked, her voice as neutral as ever. "How do they fit into this path of yours?" "Honestly," Marcus said, "I think you've taught me more than anyone else I've met out here. You see things differently. It's refreshing." "Refreshing," she repeated almost to herself. "That's an unusual way to describe an alien perspective." "You're not just any alien," Marcus said with a smile. "You've got this sharp, analytical mind, but there's a lot more to you than data charts and field reports." Elara's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she turned her attention back to the crystalline flowers. "I appreciate the sentiment, though I'm not sure I see myself in quite the same way." "Well," Marcus said lightly, "maybe I'm just seeing something you haven't noticed yet." Their walk continued, the conversation flowing freely as the promenade's noise ebbed and surged. When they finally returned to the quieter corridors near their assigned quarters, Elara stopped outside her door. She looked at Marcus, her expression unreadable. "This was a productive outing," she said at last. "Thank you for suggesting it." "Any time," Marcus said. "I'm glad you came." For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then Elara stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. A small gesture almost imperceptible. Marcus looked down at her hand, then back at her, his smile softening. "Good night, Marcus," she said, her voice quieter than before. "Good night, Elara." As she turned and entered her quarters, Marcus stood there for a moment, a faint trace of her touch still lingering. It wasn't just the warmth of her hand he felt, but something deeper, a connection he hadn't expected. And for the first time, he wondered if this path they were walking together might lead somewhere neither of them had anticipated. Chapter 6. The Kiss. The Arboretum was quiet in the station's artificial evening. The only sound came from the soft rush of water cascading through the decorative streams that lined the garden's pathways. Marcus leaned against a railing overlooking a small pond, watching the reflections of distant stars ripple on its surface. He had gotten used to meeting Elara here, but tonight felt different. Something in her manner, in the way she had asked to meet him after her shift, suggested she had more on her mind than research notes. Elara arrived silently, her presence marked only by the faint glow of the plants around her. She approached without her usual brisk, purposeful steps. Marcus noticed her hands were clasped loosely in front of her, a gesture that, for someone as composed as her, seemed almost hesitant. "You're here," she said, her voice calm as ever. "You sounded like you had something on your mind," Marcus replied. "I thought I'd come see what it was." Elara stepped to the railing, her gaze moving over the water. She didn't speak immediately, and Marcus waited. Over time, he had learned not to rush her. Elara always chose her words carefully, as though speaking them too quickly might diminish their meaning. "You've been an unusual presence in my life," she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. Marcus chuckled softly. "Is that a compliment or a complaint?" "I'm not entirely certain," she admitted. "You've challenged many of my assumptions. About your species, about how connections form. Is that a bad thing?" he asked, watching her face for any hint of emotion. "I'm not accustomed to it," she said, still looking at the water. "My work has always been my priority. Understanding the galaxy's species, documenting their biology and behavior. That's what defines me." "Work isn't everything, Elara," Marcus said gently. "You're allowed to have more." "That's exactly what I mean," she said, turning to him. "You say things like that. You're allowed to have more. Do you realize how strange that sounds to someone who has never considered more?" "I don't think it's strange at all," he replied. "You're smart, curious, and a hell of a lot more compassionate than you let on. Why shouldn't you want more than just work?" Elara held his gaze, her pale eyes searching his. Then she stepped closer so they were standing side by side at the railing. Marcus could feel the slight warmth of her presence, the faintest shift in the air between them. "I've never understood how humans can form connections so easily," she said. "How you can open yourselves to others without fear of being hurt or disappointed." "It's not that we don't feel fear," Marcus said. "We just decide that the risk is worth it." "Worth what?" He turned to face her fully, leaning slightly closer. "Worth moments like this." Elara blinked, caught off guard by the quiet intensity in his voice. For a moment, she seemed to consider stepping back, to retreat into the safety of logic and reason. But instead, she stayed where she was, watching him carefully. "I'm not certain I know what I'm supposed to do," she admitted. "You don't have to know," Marcus said. "You just have to feel." Elara's gaze dropped briefly to his mouth, and when she looked back into his eyes, something shifted. Marcus didn't move at first, giving her a chance to step away if she wanted to. But she didn't. Slowly, tentatively, Elara leaned forward. Marcus met her halfway, their lips brushing lightly at first, then lingering. It wasn't rushed or urgent. It was simply there. An unspoken agreement between two very different beings who had found something in each other they hadn't expected. When they broke apart, Elara didn't step back. She stayed close, her breath steady but shallow. Marcus looked at her, searching her expression for any sign of regret. Instead, he saw something he had never seen before, a flicker of vulnerability in her normally composed face. "Was that?" she began, then hesitated. "Was that what you wanted?" Marcus smiled softly. "What I wanted was for you to trust yourself. The kiss was just a bonus." She raised an eyebrow at him, her usual poise returning just enough to mask whatever emotions were swirling beneath the surface. "You're insufferable." "Not the first time I've heard that," he said, his grin widening. "But I'll take it." Alara let out a quiet breath, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "I need time to consider this." "Take all the time you need," Marcus said. "I'm not going anywhere." She nodded, her gaze lingering on him for another moment before she turned and began walking toward the Arboretum's exit. Marcus stayed by the railing, watching her until she disappeared from view. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope that her carefully built walls might finally be coming down. But he didn't push. He knew Alara well enough by now. If she was going to open up, she would do it on her terms. And that was more than enough for him. Chapter 7: Balancing Worlds. The trade station's conference hall was nearly empty, its gleaming floor reflecting the faint light of the holographic displays on the walls. Marcus paced near one of the long tables, tapping his fingers on the surface. He glanced at his communicator and then back at the doorway, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. Alara arrived a few moments later, her movements brisk. She looked as composed as always, her research uniform pristine, but Marcus could tell something was off. Her steps were slightly more measured, her posture a touch too rigid. "You're late," he said, folding his arms. "That's not like you." "I was held up by my supervisor," she replied, her tone clipped. "There were questions about my recent reports." "Questions?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Since when do they second-guess your data?" "It's not about the data itself," she said. "It's about how I've been spending my time. Apparently, my colleagues have noticed I've been distracted." Marcus stopped pacing. "Distracted? What does that mean?" "They think I've been compromising my objectivity," Alara said, her voice a bit quieter. "That my personal interactions with you have influenced my work." He frowned. "Have they?" "I don't believe so," she said quickly. "But their perception is enough to cause concern." Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. "So, what does that mean for us?" "I'm not sure," she admitted, looking down at her hands. "I value our conversations, our connection. But if it jeopardizes my career..." "Is it really that black and white?" Marcus asked. "Can't you have both? Your work and whatever this is between us?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've always lived by a strict set of guidelines. My career defines me. But now, I find myself questioning if that's enough." "You've changed," Marcus said, his tone softer. "I can see it. And maybe that's not a bad thing." Alara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You're very sure of yourself." "I'm not, actually," Marcus admitted. "I don't know where this is going any more than you do, but I know it's worth trying." "Worth trying," she echoed. "That's easy for you to say. Your people are accustomed to taking risks for personal relationships. And yours aren't?" he asked, genuinely curious. "We don't prioritize them the way humans do," Alara said. "Our society values logic and efficiency above all. Emotional entanglements are considered counterproductive." "Do you believe that?" "I did," she said. "I'm not so certain now." Marcus stepped closer. "Then maybe that's something worth exploring." Alara hesitated, glancing at the doorway as though expecting someone to walk in. When no one did, she turned back to him. "This isn't simple, Marcus. If I choose to pursue this, it could change everything about how I'm perceived, how my work is valued." "And if you don't?" he asked. "If you walk away now, what do you think will happen?" "I would return to my usual routine," she said. "I would continue my research, maintain my reputation." "But," Marcus prompted. "But I would always wonder," she admitted quietly, "if I made the right choice." They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Then Marcus reached out, his hand lightly brushing hers. It wasn't an overt gesture, but it was enough. She didn't pull away. "You don't have to decide right now," he said. "Just don't shut the door on it completely." Alara looked down at their hands, then back up at him. "You're asking me to take a risk." I'm asking you to consider the possibility that some risks are worth taking. Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. You're very persuasive. I try, he said with a small grin. For the first time, Alara felt the slightest glimmer of clarity. It wasn't about choosing one world over the other. It was about finding a balance, however uncertain, between the life she had built and the life she was only beginning to imagine. Chapter 8. A New Perspective. The trade station's observation deck offered a stunning view of the stars. Alara and Marcus stood side by side, their reflections faintly visible in the thick glass that separated them from the infinite expanse. The light from a nearby star cast a soft glow, illuminating the quiet space. It was a place that seemed detached from the noise and commotion of the rest of the station. A place where it was easy to forget that they were two very different people from two very different worlds. I used to think I had everything figured out, Alara said, her gaze fixed on the distant, flickering stars. My life was structured, predictable. Everything I did followed a pattern I could rely on. Marcus glanced at her, leaning his shoulder against the window. And now I'm not so certain, she admitted. Meeting you has changed how I view things. You've made me question whether I was truly content with the life I had. He smiled faintly. It's not a bad thing to ask those questions. Sometimes it's how we grow. Alara turned toward him, her expression calm but thoughtful. Your people speak often of growth, of progress. For the Othanis, growth has always been a calculated process, improvements based on logic, on data. Yet what you've shown me is that some changes cannot be measured. They're felt. Marcus straightened, stepping closer. Do you think that's a bad thing? No, she said quietly. I think it's what I needed. Her words hung in the air, unspoken emotions weaving between them. Marcus studied her, noting the slight softening of her posture, the faint warmth in her usually clinical tone. He wasn't sure if she would ever say the words directly, but he felt them in the way she stood with him, in the way her barriers seemed a little lower every time they met. Alara, he said, his voice low, what do you want? Not what you think you should do or what others expect of you. What do you want? She hesitated, searching for the right words. I want to understand this feeling, this connection. It's unlike anything I've known. Then maybe you should let yourself feel it, Marcus said gently. Don't analyze it. Don't try to predict where it'll lead. Just let it be. She regarded him for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over her. Then, as if making a decision she had been considering for some time, she reached out and placed her hand over his. It was a small gesture, but one that carried a significance she didn't need to explain. Marcus responded by curling his fingers gently around hers. They stood like that for a while, watching the stars together, saying nothing. No promises, no declarations. Just a shared understanding that something had shifted between them. For Alara, it was the first time she allowed herself to simply be present. To let her guard down, even if only slightly, and accept that her life didn't have to be defined solely by structure and logic. There could be room for something unexpected, something that wasn't just a chemical reaction or a data point on a chart. And for Marcus, it was a reminder of why he had taken the risks he had, why he had reached out to someone so different from himself. Because in those differences, he had found a connection he hadn't expected. As the stars continued their silent dance beyond the glass, Alara felt a sense of calm she hadn't known before. She wasn't sure where this would lead, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to find out.